in a home or boarding school or industrial institution where they can be kept constantly and regularly at school and away from the evil influences of the heathen life. Formalized later in legislation and made mandatory in the early 20th century, there were 135 residential schools in Canada operated by the Roman Catholic, Anglican, United, and Presbyterian churches. We ran 13 of them. In the 2008 government apology, Prime Minister Harper acknowledged two primary objectives of the residential school system were to remove and isolate children from the influence of their homes, families, traditions, and cultures, and to assimilate them into the dominant culture. These objectives were based on the assumption Aboriginal cultures and spiritual beliefs were inferior and unequal. Well, over 150,000 Indigenous children were sent to these schools, often hundreds of miles from their homes, and the parents were jailed if they refused to send them. Paternalistic and racist attitudes that made the schools ripe for underfunding, neglect, and abuse were rampant. Education was partial, designed for domestic and farm labor. Many children experienced the schools as incarceration. In the 50s, in Toronto in Sunday school, as I was singing, "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so," Indigenous children in church-run schools were being taught to be ashamed of themselves, to be ashamed of their families, their culture, their language, and their beliefs, that they must in fact reject them and be remade in our image in order to be acceptable to that same God. You may be wondering whether there were any voices of opposition to the schools, and there were a few. Teacher Lucy Affleck wrote to our Superintendent of Indian Missions on October 3, 1929, describing what she called the true conditions of one of the schools in Saskatchewan. She noted that the children were often cold, the food was inadequate, the pigs were fed the milk, there was a lack of clean water, and she suspected that at least 90% of the children had tuberculosis. Ms. Affleck was fired for disloyalty. Our church supported the residential school system, and it continued to do so until the government ended our role in 1969. In 1958, just a decade before, a church commission noted that while funding from the government was not sufficient, the principals needed to be better trained, and there were difficulties in enlisting suitable personnel. Quote, "There can be no doubt that the residential schools have for more than 100 years made an incalculable contribution to the lives of Indian people of Canada. Moreover, few will deny that they will be needed for many years to come." In 1969, as our role was ended by the government, a profound silence descended on the United Church. Perhaps a silence of shame, not dissimilar from the shame felt by survivors, many of whom never spoke even to their families about what they had experienced there. The United Church began its process of remembering, of bringing to mind, in the 1984 General Council, when Alberta Billy from BC insisted that the church owed an apology to Native people for the way it had treated them. And in 1986, most of you will know that moderator Bill Smith confessed our Eurocentric and Christocentric mission. Quote, "We confused Western ways and culture with the length and breadth and depth and height of the gospel of Christ. We imposed our civilization as a condition of accepting the gospel. We tried to make you be like us, and in doing so, we helped to destroy the vision that made you what you were. End of quote. This powerful apology began our journey of accountability for the terrible impacts of colonialism. There was, though, in the apology, no reference to residential schools. What really awakened our church to the harm of the schools was the lawsuits that the survivors began to file against us beginning in the 1990s. Our general council and many congregations alike reacted with fear of massive liability and potential bankruptcy. It was not only a financial threat, it challenged our self-image as a progressive social justice church. In the courts, the government claimed that the church was solely responsible for the harm that was done in the schools because it ran the schools. And the church argued that the government was at fault since the schools were government policy. In 1998, a judge held that both entities were liable and that compensation was to be paid. So we negotiated a cap on our liability with the government. Once our financial liability was capped, we began to be able to let go of the fear and to hear the stories and pain beneath the lawsuits. This shift in focus from protecting ourselves to accountability began our journey of understanding, our journey of remembering the devastating impact of the schools on survivors and on their communities. In the abuse claims under the settlement agreement and at the hearings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, our hearts were broken and broken open as courageous survivors told horrifying and chillingly consistent stories of being underfed, chronically cold, lonely, harshly disciplined, and sexually abused. Prohibited from speaking their languages, students suffer the devastating psychological impacts of trauma, separation, loss, fear, anger, confusion, and even despair. Many spent a decade or more in the schools, away from their homes. Some ran away. Thousands died of disease, some of violence, and many were buried anonymously, with their parents never being informed of their death or where they were buried. Many never returned home, leaving their families to wonder what had become of them. And often those who did return home found that they could no longer speak their language or relate to their community values and life. They had suffered wounds to the soul, humiliation and degradation, shame and uncertainty about their identity, lives marred by rage, by poverty, addictions, violence, and incarceration. Nearly half of the 80,000 former students still living at the time of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission had been criminally abused. These experiences were hard to hear and even harder to understand. They left survivors asking, why did your people do this to us? Why do they hate us so much? And they left many in the church asking, how did our understanding of the gospel of Christ become so distorted? With this deeper awareness of the harm that we had done, our church offered a second apology specifically to former students, their families, and communities. Moderator Bill Phipps said, quote, "On behalf of the United Church of Canada, I apologize for the pain and the suffering that our church's involvement in the residential school system has caused. We are aware of some of the damage that this cruel and ill-conceived system of assimilation has caused. For this, we are truly and most humbly sorry, and we commit ourselves to ensuring that we will never again use our power as a church to hurt others with attitudes of racial or spiritual superiority. You did nothing wrong. You were and are the victims of evil acts that cannot, under any circumstances, be justified or excused. End of quote. The impact of the colonial mentality of racial superiority is what our neighbors have against us. Now, not all school staff were cruel and abusive, of course. Many taught with kindness and good intentions, seeing this remote work as their ministry. This has led some in the church to dismiss the stories of abuse as the actions of a few bad apples among the staff. But we now know that our complicity was both individual and systemic. The TRC called the residential schools cultural genocide. We participated in a systemic attempt to eradicate a people. That also is part of our history. Others in the church have resisted reparative action, asking, well, haven't we acknowledged the harm and apologized? Can't we just all move on? But the destructive impact of the residential schools on Indigenous peoples is deep and long-term and intergenerational. The trauma, the loss of language and culture, the shame in their heritage, the confusion about identity and their self-worth have also affected their children and their grandchildren, their communities and their culture. It's a legacy that they continue to live with, and it's a legacy that we must continue to live with as well. The harm over 100 years in the making will take generations to repair. The more appropriate question for us to be asking is, how do we appropriately live out our apologies? How do we make things right, or at least how do we begin? The final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as most of you might know, includes 94 calls to action, which are a roadmap to healing, justice, and reconciliation for our nation. The calls advocate changes in virtually every sector of Canadian life: education, health, law, it goes on. In tabling the report, Chair Justice Murray Sinclair said, "We have described for you a mountain. We have shown you the path to the top. It is up to you to do the climbing." Survivors themselves are best positioned to define what's required for reconciliation. Linda David Cree told the TRC what reconciliation would look like to her. When the racist papal bulls codifying the doctrine of discovery are revoked and denounced. When our languages, cultures, traditional knowledge are acknowledged, respected, and taught in our schools and communities with the same resources and support that French and English minority languages receive in Canada. When Indigenous peoples receive their fair share of the wealth from our country's resources. When Canada can stand before the United Nations and accept recommendations related to Indigenous rights. When Canada makes treaty implementation and land claims a priority. And most importantly, she said, when our people unlearn cultural self-hatred and lateral violence, taught in residential schools and now perpetuated in our communities. Now, you will know that the United Church has begun the climb. Guided by Indigenous elders, we have taken steps to follow up with our apologies with some action. We've already heard about a donation to the Healing Fund. It was originally established in 1994 to support community healing programs, particularly for former students and their families. We also adopted 6 right relations principles in 2003 General Council to guide all of our interactions. The kind of principles that indicate that you don't make decisions about people unless they're part of the decision. We settled abuse claims quickly and fairly as part of demonstrating that we were taking responsibility. We didn't fight claims. We settled them quickly and as fairly as we could. We were full parties to the negotiations of the Union Residential School Settlement Agreement and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission process. We submitted every single document in our church at the national and conference level that was related to the schools to the TRC, something that was one of our obligations, and as you often read in the paper that the churches didn't fulfill it, we did. We developed our own website, the childrenremembered.ca, where you can go and learn information about our schools, pictures and histories of each of the 13 schools in which we were involved. We funded a mobile counselor to visit 4 northern BC coastal communities to help with the psychological healing that survivors were going through. We created an Indigenous, non-Indigenous right relations network and newsletter. The General Council executive repudiated the doctrine of discovery. We revised our crest, as you know, to acknowledge the presence of Indigenous congregations at the time of union. We strengthened the Indigenous ministry's voice and decision-making power within the church. A couple of years ago, we set aside $3 million for research efforts into possible unmarked burial sites at our school sites. In 2018, the United Church Indigenous Ministries Council issued its own roadmap for reconciliation. Titled Calls to the Church, the report recommended changes our church could make internally so that Indigenous and non-Indigenous congregations can walk together in respect and equality. That's what the recent remit was about. There have been many, many other initiatives. This is just a few that I know at the national level, but there have been many initiatives that you might be a part of as a region or as a congregational level. So work is being done, but there is still a long climb ahead of us to repair the damage done by residential schools and by the larger colonialism enterprise. And our voice continues to be needed to advocate for an end to the structural injustice and racism that continue to characterize public attitudes and political policy. Reconciliation requires healing on both sides, for the oppressor as well as the oppressed. The pain of our complicity in the harm done to our neighbor can teach us to listen to others with more humility, with less certainty, with less spiritual elitism. It can push us beyond stereotypes to the awareness of how our own privilege is embedded in our assumptions, our attitudes, and our experience. We are an Easter people, believing in the possibility of new life, not because we have done no harm, but because we trust that hate and prejudice and evil, the things that corrupt and destroy life, do not have the last word. The call to own our past and to work on right relations is a beckoning of the Spirit, a call to enter more deeply into the realities of those around us who have been invisible or whom we have dismissed, those whom we have hurt, to listen to them and to rediscover through them our own sacred connectedness. Decolonization and reconciliation are the gifts that we can bring to the altar in the next 100 years. May it be so. Thank you for listening to me.